schön, dass wir heute wieder zusammenkommen können. Es ist das letzte Mal der großartigen Reihe Transformation des Fremdsprachenlernens, wie künstliche Intelligenz auch das Fremdsprachenlernen und Lehren beeinflusst. Wir hatten unglaublich interessante, spannende Gäste und Keynote-Speaker, die das Thema tatsächlich auch so rübergebracht haben, dass selbst ich es verstehe als Moderator. And today, that's why I'm switching to English now, we have the honor of Michael Campbell. He is just arrived in Bangkok, and he's so up for it. He's sitting there, and we connected him, and now we're really looking forward to Michael, because he's the founder of Glossika, and for 3 decades he's researched diachronic dialectology, and I'm a TV presenter, I really have no clue of these things. So Michael, maybe first of all, could you in very simple words explain to me what exactly you're researching on, and in simple words, or maybe an example of how I can understand your field of research?
Okay, thank you very much, Philip, for your presentation. Well, the word diachronic, I mean, it comes from Greek, so for all of us, it can be Greek to me or to you. So diachronic just simply means it simply just means like 2 periods of time. So it's comparing language in 2 different periods of time, or perhaps how that language has changed over time. So for example, you may have heard of something like, I'm sure that now you speak Hochdeutsch, but maybe in the previous eras, there were different kinds of German, Altdeutsch, or maybe, previous, I'm not even sure how we refer to them in English or German, but because my research was primarily with Chinese and then some dialectology of European languages, but less so much Germanic. So, but thank you very much for the introduction. Yes, I'm the founder of Glossika, and so Glossika is a language learning platform.
Before you start, let me just emphasize that afterwards, we will have a Q&A session, and whatever you want to know about Glossika, whatever you want to know about old dialects, etc., put it into the chat, and we will talk about it straight afterwards. So now enjoy the keynote speech of Michael Campbell.
Right. So specifically, I'm going to be talking about how this research has led me on to different paths of research, why I started the company, and some of the interesting things that we're working on in the company. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about dialects, because I think that this also affects all of us in our daily lives, and it also affects how we approach language, how we view language, and how we treat language in the field of pedagogy. So I started my career almost 30 years ago, researching, like I just mentioned, diachronic dialectology. And that was specifically among the languages of China and some languages of Europe. I worked as a Chinese and English translator and interpreter, and provided a variety of business services to hundreds of corporate clients for many years before I decided to start my own company. So during those years, my curiosity never waned, and I continued to read extensively in linguistics about the following topics, really: semanto-syntactic mapping, first-order logic, the history of language families, L2A, and how learners acquire vocabulary, long-range etymologies, and the history of human migration. It may sound like this is a really wide variety of fields, but they all have a common thread. And so a deeper curiosity in one of these led me down a path to learn all about the others. In the West, we refer to languages as individual entities. They are incomprehensible to each other, and usually they have a standard form of writing and speaking. And we refer to dialects as partially comprehensible, but without a standard. In the East, however, specifically with Chinese, languages and dialects are referred to as topolects, or in Chinese, they use the word fangyan, which means a speech of a certain place. And that's why I said the word topolect, because they are a speech of a certain place. So there is some overlap with the nuance of the English word dialect, but it is not completely the same meaning. In fact, the words language and dialect in China are for the most part interchangeable. So it is possible to encounter translations from Chinese that may refer to a national language, such as Russian, as a dialect. The phrase is correct when spoken in Chinese, but that's because Russian is a topolect. But it is incorrect in English if we were to call Russian a dialect, and therefore that would be a faulty translation. Chinese does not have a word that encompasses the same nuance, the meanings that the word dialect has. And so dialect in German also would fall into the same nuance. So this specifically means a variety of speech that is partially mutually comprehensible. So for example, you can think of the dialects that you have in German. Many of them you may understand, some of them you may not understand. There may be words that you don't understand, but for the most part, it wouldn't be difficult to really, pick up, try to understand what somebody is saying when they're speaking in dialect. So if we consider the Western definition of dialect as a language that possesses an established relation with small but predictable differences from, let's say, the language that you speak, then one can say that perhaps all of the languages within a specific branch of a language family, let's say that's Slavic or Germanic, they are to some extent largely just all dialects of each other. They are slightly different with predictable sound changes that lead to the inability to understand each other. So because of that inability to understand, we then call them languages. And then we've gone on to standardize them. Though for some countries like Norway, they haven't settled on a single standard yet. So in most countries, the standard is created. It's a created language that nobody actually speaks natively. So this is true with Mandarin Chinese, Filipino, Indonesian, Finnish, Dutch, German, French, Italian, Arabic, and the list is very long. In fact, I've never met a native speaker of Filipino, which is largely based on Tagalog and a mixing of many other languages. But I always continue to meet Tagalog native speakers. So when native speakers switch to a national standard like Filipino, they must consciously speak in a very specific way that eliminates all trace of their native dialect. But it is most likely not their most natural or native way of speaking. It is quite similar to how I'm speaking English right now, which is neither here nor there. You may want to ask or even argue this point with me. Are you saying that there are no native speakers of Mandarin Chinese? And that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that the standard language you learn as a foreigner is a high register and with a standard pronunciation that few native speakers speak, except for the reasons I will give in a moment. There is so much regional variation in Mandarin that you may encounter someone who says they speak Mandarin, but even if you were a competent Mandarin speaker, would discover that you cannot understand a single sentence this person is saying. Is it because you didn't learn Mandarin correct? You may start to understand them only after being exposed for a week or two. But because you learned the way they speak, because you started to notice the regular sound and vocabulary differences in the way they speak. In fact, the person you're speaking to may understand you perfectly well right from the beginning because he's heard the standard his whole life, but you may not be able to understand him. On the other hand, in Taiwan, there is no regional variation in the Mandarin spoken, so everybody speaks in one and the same way. But this happened historically in only just one generation as a replacement to the other languages already spoken there, namely Hakka and Hokkien. And so the same can be said in southern China, where everybody learns Mandarin as a foreign language. It replaces their native languages and everybody sounds like they speak the standard more or less correctly. In this case, if you learn Mandarin, you're more likely to understand somebody from southern China or Taiwan than you would a person who grew up in a native Mandarin speaking location, because they have a very strong accent from where they grew up, or they speak in dialect. All right, so let me continue. After a standard has existed for several generations, and through mass communication and intermarriage, where families start to adopt the standard at home for ease of communication, we've seen the gradual adoption of standards as native languages and the falling away of dialect use. This has been our understanding of dialects. But what I'm proposing you to consider here is that all of these national standards within a language branch as dialects of each other. The standardization of languages is as arbitrary as the size of a given country. So if you think about that for a moment, the standardization of languages is as arbitrary as the size of a country. If countries like Italy were not so completely unified as they are today, then we would have several standard languages for every country that would have been in existence. And yet, those languages really do exist within Italy today, but as dialects. But let's talk a little bit more about language diversity and language branches. Germanic is a branch of languages with a high amount of diversity. Some languages have had more external interference and have gone through simplification and have diverged more greatly, such as the case with English. The reason why I say this is because the acquisition of English for speakers of European languages is a special case that need not apply to acquiring the other European languages. For example, you need to know both Romance and Germanic, really, to acquire English well. The educational process for teaching English as a foreign language, or teaching English speakers to acquire other European languages such as German, should also be treated as a special case, which need not apply to speakers of many other European languages. And it's not just Europe. All of this is applicable in the exact same way to certain groups of languages of Asia, for example. Let's consider for a moment word order can be considered grammar. In Chinese and all the other Austric language families of Southeast Asia, grammar is defined by word order. I say word order should be considered grammar because when word order has such a rigid rules and it's become so solidified or petrified in the way that you say things in a specific order, then any deviation from that order leads to a breakdown in understanding. So if you have a different dialect that says something in slightly different word order, or even if I don't speak your language with the right word order, you're just not going to understand me. And this is even true in German, which I'm sure you're very aware of as educators of German. If a student places a verb in the wrong place, you correct them or you indicate the correct position. Is that not grammar? As I said, it makes sense to treat learners of closely related languages with a more efficient strategy than one we would use for learning English, for how English learners learn other languages. And I'll touch on each of these perspectives shortly. I just spent the last month in Eastern Europe immersed with the Slovak and Polish languages, two Western Slavic languages. I've been literate in Russian already for many years, which is an Eastern Slavic language. Other than the highest frequency vocabulary and a few function words, these languages require little effort to learn once you know one of them well. All of the word roots are the same, and there are slight differences in meanings that different prepositions attached to verbs display, but on a whole can be applied predictably. Now that I'm familiar with Slovak and Polish, now when I see or hear another language called Czech, it immediately feels foreign, but yet also understandable. It just has slightly different patterns that I haven't internalized yet. Having a large vocabulary in at least one of the languages is of great importance because learning another language within the branch may use less frequent vocabulary as their main preference. I've noticed this same phenomenon in Chinese as well. I speak both Hokkien and Hakka, regional languages of Chinese, and I've noticed that even those words that can be considered dialectal actually do show up in written Mandarin as low frequency vocabulary or more literate vocabulary. Though speakers of those dialects easily understand this vocabulary, a monolingual native speaker of Mandarin may not necessarily understand without having expanded his literary repertoire. I've also found that learning dialects or regional languages has enriched the range of expression available to me as a near-native Mandarin speaker. So Slavic languages share a lot of similar expressions. And from these, we can see some of the patterns demonstrated. Take, for example, the Russian phrase, "porядке," meaning that everything is in order, everything is fine, okay, or no problem. It's a very common phrase. I know the word is masculine from its nominative form. In Slovak, they say "v porядku" or "v porядku," and in Polish, "w porządku." First, I noticed the end of the word is "u" and not "je," as in Russian, so I can probably predictably do this to every word in Polish now without having to study a declension table. I just use what I already know as a Russian speaker. The second thing I notice is that Polish has an extra nasal sound. So immediately I start to pay attention to this extra nasal in some words. And if I don't understand, try deleting the nasal to see if I understand the word. Because it's an extra sound. If I just get rid of it, it might be equal to the word that I already know in Russian or maybe in Slovak. So for example, we can take the word piąć, the Polish word piąć, and without the nasal, it sounds like the Russian pięć, meaning the word for 5. And in Slovak, it has a further deletion. So it doesn't say piać, it says just peć, peć. So piąć, piać, peć. They're all basically the same word. They're just a slight sound correspondence difference. The other thing I notice is that all 3 languages spell words in their own way, even though the sounds are almost identical. So they have very different spelling systems. So spelling can really throw us off as language learners if we just learn to use our ear. For example, the Russian word "ticho," which means quiet or silently, this is spelled with T in Russian. And in Polish, the word is "cicho," but it's spelled with a C. And you probably wouldn't even recognize it by sight if you were just reading, because you won't associate the C as equivalent with T in other languages. Next, with "w porządku," the first example I gave you, I noticed Polish fricates the R, and Russian palatalizes it, and Slovak has neither of those. So I know Czech has a trilled version of this Polish sound, so I'm pretty confident I would understand and recognize and be able to say this phrase in Czech, which I guess would be "w porządku," "w porządku," and without ever having studied Czech, just because I know of its sound correspondence and the likelihood that Czech also has the same phrase. I don't know if my ending is right, but both Polish and Slovak have the same ending, so statistically speaking, it's highly likely to be the same. I didn't have to reference a grammar book. I didn't have to reference I didn't have to do anything to really learn this Czech phrase. In fact, I can probably guess the Czech way to say it without ever having studied Czech. So if I hear something in Czech that doesn't conform to these correspondences, I'm very likely to notice that right away and make note of it. I've heard that Czech also has some very irregular changes, so that might affect my understanding. But the point that I'm making here is that if I'm going to learn another language, in fact, I probably already know that language if I just apply a few sound correspondences and then just listen and get a lot of input from the way native speakers speak. So if everybody learns European languages the way that they learned English through this very long process, it would be ridiculous for, let's say, a Ukrainian to learn Polish this way. In theory, they already know and speak the language. They just need to adjust the way they pronounce all of the words in a very regular way, and that can be achieved in just a few weeks rather than years. And so the same can be said of a Dutch person learning German, right? I'm sure you know this. A Dane, a Swede, or a Norwegian as well. They have a little bit more challenge involved with, for example, the genders. and they may have a little bit more challenge with the word order, but for the most part, it's like learning a dialect. Even between Polish and German, crossing over language branches from Slavic to Germanic, it's possible to unlock many correspondences in the kinds of prepositions that attach to the verbs, and even the patterns in the perfective and imperfective verb patterns, which German does not have, but they manifest in German through these prepositional separable and inseparable verbs. So if you understand separable and inseparable verbs very well, you would learn a Slovak language very quickly. And now we get to the situation of how we pass this knowledge on to a student who wants to acquire the language. The problem here is that knowledge does not translate into competency. Just because I know these things does not mean that I can speak. So any amount of explanation, as I'm doing in this presentation, would not help anybody. In fact, to make this truly applicable, we have to let the student make the discovery on his or her own, and it may not even be a real conscious discovery, but rather a pattern that just clicks and leads to speaking fluency faster and more efficiently. In order to make this work for the student, we need to make a large list of all the correspondences in a regular format so that they pick up on the pattern naturally. Ideally, word order patterns, the various movements of words in a sentence, for example, German verbs, all need to be listed out. Ideally, every single language pair should have their own individual set of correspondences that make this discovery readily available for the student. And who is going to research all of these languages and these patterns? And how is this even possible? And so this is where first order logic comes in, which is a kind of science. You know, first order logic is science. So languages use certain patterns to express real world logic in very regular ways. Real world logic obeys the laws of physics and animacy. And animacy just means that I am a person, I am not a rock, I'm not a stone, and so I'm animate and the stone is not. So a lot of things that are ambiguous, for example, maybe English or Chinese does not have marking on certain nouns, things may become ambiguous in terms of active and passive paradigms. These actually make perfect sense when following the laws of physics and animacy. This is why in English, we don't confuse the unaccusative phrase, the door opens, as having the meaning that the door uses its own ability to open something else. No, only one meaning is possible following this logic. However, because languages label things in a variety of ways, why not use a system that labels everything that languages label on their grammars back to first order logic, and then align all of these patterns? So based on my reading and research, I established a set of 90 syntacto-semantic tags that map back to first order logic and then I applied all of these thousands of sentences that manifest a range of syntactic and semantic patterns. For example, in English, normally anything that our body experiences is still expressed using the pronoun I as the subject of the sentence. But this doesn't help students figure out the pattern for when other languages use me, because otherwise an English speaker will encounter that sometimes I is I and sometimes I is me. And how would the student be able to recognize the pattern entirely on his own? Of course, we can use grammar explanations and hope that they will somehow apply it in their real speaking. But by aligning the groups of these patterns together and giving the student something to actually practice and train, the student learns all of these sample sentences together and they pick up the patterns naturally. In fact, these alignments, they work individually for all languages and their individual patterns. So what is interesting about this approach is that it works well with languages that supposedly have very difficult grammars to explain, such as Hungarian or Georgian. The former, which has a very large number of cases, and the latter, which we refer to as a split ergative language, which means that it has very specific rules about their animacy and who is doing what in the sentence. But the pleasantly surprising thing about these languages is that they conform to first order logic much better than any other European language. So I don't know Hungarian, but from a first order logic point of view, it appears quite perfect. And European languages, especially English, are very convoluted. especially when it comes to tagging them back to first-order logic. I must also state that ergative languages align to first-order logic much better than nominative accusative languages. So this is simply because first-order logic and ergative languages don't have subject and objects. They have agents and patients. When we consider that the naming conventions within grammar can vary from language to language, for example, the present perfect tense, the imperfect tense, the past tense, I mean, which of these are equivalent and which are different? And for which source and target languages are we talking about? It can quickly become very confusing for both student and teacher. By aligning the patterns and practicing through those patterns and allowing the student to discover those patterns, it's possible to avoid all of this naming confusion. To be frankly honest with you, native speakers do not even grasp these labels very well themselves. At another presentation I gave recently, I asked a native Spanish speaker to conjugate a verb in the third person plusquamperfect tense, and he was unable to do so. And yet, our grammar descriptions are frequently insufficient or mired by an extensive amount of exceptions. For example, in Russian, there really should be 8 noun cases, not 6. Not every noun can be a location, but some nouns that are do have a locative case. And not every noun is animate, as I demonstrated earlier, but yet animate nouns have their own patient case, which declines like genitive, but isn't really genitive, but really should be its own case. All the exceptions. I'm not surprised to find more cases in other Slavic languages, but even if you ask a native speaker, they would be hard-pressed to generate the endings of random words in some random case. So what's more interesting to me is that most nouns never occur in all cases in natural speech. Most nouns only occur in 1, 2, maybe 3 cases. The same can be said of verb conjugations as well. And some nouns are only said in very specific sequences. Like I said earlier, "порядке" in Russian, it only occurs in the prepositional case in that case. So it's rather silly to memorize massive declension paradigms when most instances may never occur in real life, or maybe just once in your lifetime. So let me talk briefly about vocabulary acquisition. My particular interest is with acquisition across language families due to the overwhelming difficulty of acquiring a large volume of completely different vocabulary. I really enjoy this kind of challenge, and my strategy to date has been to learn a representative language from as many different language families as possible. This represents very massive challenges in terms of memory and vocabulary. We can assume that the vocabulary in every language family is completely different, made up of completely different roots. But what I found is that the more variety that I'm exposed to, the more I realize how similar all of our language families really are, and how certain kinds of universal sounds or points of articulation in the mouth refer to core semantic concepts. There have been a few attempts at researching this further in scientific papers. However, there isn't a lot of concrete evidence for something that appears as a gut feeling, at least it does to me. So trying to describe this phenomenon is quite difficult in order to conform with the standards of the scientific community. But it is nevertheless something to seriously consider. I encourage you to watch my presentation at the 2022 Polyglot Conference, where I dive into the subject of human language sound change over a 74,000-year period, and some of the universals we can consider that appear in dozens of language families. My specific goal has always been how to turn these discoveries and patterns into applicable solutions for language learning and allow students to make more of their own discoveries in language learning, which lend themselves to experiences that turn into long-term memories. And finally, let me come back to syntacto-semantic labeling, also referred to as semantic role labeling. Around the year 2017, a new team of language specialists showed up at Google who specialized specifically in this. And a few short years later, we find that Google's natural language understanding has improved many times over what it was previously capable of. In fact, these methodologies are proving successful in a wide range of applications. They're used in training zero-shot translation technology for under-resourced languages, to which Google was able to update translations across all of their previous languages and add another 24 languages in 2022 alone. And to better serving customers in Google search, or even figuring out what you actually intend to do in Google Maps, to great advances in speech and voice recognition. The kinds of massively parallel data sets that we're developing at Glossika, tagged in this format, I believe can help many companies in developing their own AI technologies. If you consider for a moment that the quality of your AI in applications is largely dependent on the quality of the data sets that you use to train your AI, you'll think very carefully about where you acquired your data sets and how they were tagged. You definitely do not want to be using data sets tagged on the 30-year-old Penn State tree bank, and you definitely do not want to be using freely accessible data sets from Kaggle or Spacey, since most of these data sets are just scraped from the internet and from conversations, and do not represent the wealth of valency data and word usage that a standard dictionary has. To prove this point, while our team was developing our own baseline tagging data sets, they frequently did use Spacey. But we found that Spacey lacked as much as 40% of the common vocabulary found in a standard learner's dictionary, including lacking any results on almost 100% of all separable multi-word expressions, or MWEs. And this is why it's very dangerous to just use any off-the-shelf solution for developing your AI applications. And the reason why you will be left unable to compete against the AI capabilities of the tech giants like Google, which understand things like SRL, which we are developing here at our company. So at Glossika, not only are we constantly developing new solutions for education, but we're also developing extensive data sets, massively parallel data sets, and collecting and labeling data in text, video, and audio formats, not just for hundreds of standard languages, but for every kind of dialect and variation within those languages. I believe that most of the variation in the way people speak, even these national languages, is still lacking in AI data sets. And we're in the perfect position to be able to service this industry. Thank you for listening, and I'm now ready to take your questions.
Well, thank you very, very much. It's been very interesting. Thank you. And even for me, it was very understandable. And I just thought about, I know I speak pretty much Hanoverian when I speak German, but still, when I talk, it's not the way that foreigners get taught the language of German, obviously. And
Pomeranian is from northern Germany, or?
Well, I'm originally from Bavaria, but my parents came from North Germany, so yeah, there is quite a bit of a mix-up. Now, Marietta Sander wants to know: is there a strategy for elderly students to memorize vocabulary better?
Well, I'm not sure if this is my area of expertise, but for elderly people, I think that all kinds of memory practice can really help. And I've done some interesting memory experiments in the past couple of years. I tried memorizing pi, long list of numbers, 3.141592653589793238462.
All right, okay.
Yeah, so this kind of thing is like, how many can you do, and how long does it take, and what are the effects on your memory, and how does it apply to other areas? So I find that pi is a very useless thing to do, but perhaps for old people, if they kind of develop a strategy for remembering the numbers, you'll find a knock-on effect that will affect. It also helps you with language, So I think that all kinds of practice in different things is helpful. So I would just say, don't just do one thing. Find a variety of things where you're just challenging your memory a little bit. And everyday things like, oh, where did I put my keys? This is not a memory problem. This is just daily life. That's just normal. So I'm talking about like putting things into long-term memory. Things like that. You could practice with numbers, and I find numbers a lot easier than just words. Words are very challenging. So I think you need to use a variety of strategies.
Yeah, and also it needs to make sense somehow.
It does.
The way you talked about the similarities of different Slavic languages. First of all, Hilda Malka wants to know, how many languages do you actually speak?
How many languages do I speak? Well, just in Taiwan, it's about half a dozen languages. I live in Taiwan usually, but in East Asia, there's probably at least a dozen languages, and then I also have quite extensive knowledge of many European languages, and I speak them to various degrees. my last presentation that I mentioned was actually in Spanish, but you should be able to understand it quite easily because it has a lot of common vocabulary.
Okay, well, for example, if we're looking at India, I mean, how many languages are there in India?
Oh, there's at least 700 of, yeah.
700. So you could actually be Indian and speak, I don't know, 200 languages.
Yeah, I don't know of anybody who speaks 200, but you know, an Indian who speaks 4 to 6 languages is not that uncommon.
Okay. Now, talking of these variations in different languages in the same regions, that also makes life easier, right? I mean, people could be able, if they have a bit of sensitivity for language, they could learn languages easier than if you just do one language at a time.
Sure. You know, just calling on my experience earlier this week, I was in Poland, and after I had been in Slovakia for some time, and I found that Slovak was quite challenging for me. And then when I showed up in Poland, it just seemed like everything was so much easier. I could respond to people, and I don't know if it was just a closer connection to Russian or something, but I just felt like, oh, I was responding so much more naturally. And maybe it was just a buildup of Slovak. I don't know what happened, but of course, I did a little bit of prep work on my own. I mean, I've used Glossika for both Slovak and Polish before, so I use our own software quite a bit. But you know, going from software practice to real life is you get nervous and you feel like, oh my God, it's showtime. How am I going to perform in real life? So it's always a fun thing to try, you know. But I think that don't be afraid, you know, just try to respond. And a lot of people, they just switch to English if you're just struggling, and they're busy. They're usually in the service industry and they don't have time. So their English is always better than our attempts at Polish or the language you're learning. So it's fun. But if people they're patient and they're willing to help, that they'll continue the language. I mean, they'll continue speaking in the language with you.
Yeah, and how do you conquer the barrier of embarrassment? Because for some people, it's always difficult to just start talking. But I found that that is the most important, that you actually just talk.
Well, the funny thing about the embarrassment is, okay, so let's say, for example, I'm in Poland. I want to try to speak Polish. I'm obviously not Polish. So there's no embarrassment. The person I'm speaking to, he knows I'm not Polish. And then I try to say something in his language and I say it wrong. It's not embarrassing. He might help me, you know, so it's... And
he feels, especially when you're English speaking, then he definitely feels pride when somebody else speaks Polish, especially from England or from America.
Right. So if you're a native speaker of Polish and you cannot say even the simplest, you know, greetings and responses, then you should be embarrassed.
Now, maybe we can hear a little bit more about Glossika, because you're the founder and you haven't talked much about it, but can you talk a little bit about how it works, what the AI is behind it, and maybe also how teachers of foreign languages can use it?
Right. So, I mean, we mostly use AI specifically in just algorithms and how we deal with, you know, students and the progress, and then also in tagging our data sets. So most of the AI that we're working on is actually pre-AI work. And so, you know, we don't like to use the word AI. We like to use the word machine learning. If anybody in this industry who works in this industry will know that we tend to refer to the specific parts of AI. So in this case, machine learning is the process of training your algorithms. And so you need data to train your algorithms. And if your data has too much bias in them, then the results you get is biased. And so the challenge is not, you know, the news. I mean, you said yourself, you work as a journalist, right? So the challenge is when the journalists say it wrong and they say, oh, AI is biased. Well, no, it's not the AI that is biased. It's the data set that you fed the AI to learn from. The AI does not create anything new. It just spits out what it has already learned. So it's like It's like you teach a child math, and then suddenly the child is doing some sort of advanced math that you never taught him. But that's not possible. A child would not be able to do that. The child can only repeat back the math that he has learned already. And so the AI is exactly the same. It can only do the math that you gave it. And then you ask it a question, what's 2 + 3? And it'll say 5, because it already trained it and learned that. But if you ask them some advanced math formula, it won't understand anything. So
and Glossika, maybe the area of application.
Well, I mean, there's several areas of application. So we're using it in developing our data sets. We're using it to actually make these data sets to help other companies develop their own AI technologies. So we're not doing the AI for them, but we're working specifically in the data. And then we also use AI for on the front end, which is how the students interact with the platform. And so that also affects the ordering of our data that we provide to the students. And so, there's a little bit of tailoring. And I think that every company is doing the same thing. This is not really special kind of magical science. It's pretty much the standard of how every company is working today.
Okay, then Florian wants to know, is there something similar to Hochdeutsch in other languages, or is Hochdeutsch basically like the absence of all dialects a German idea?
No, Hochdeutsch is exactly what I was describing. In France, you have the version by the Académie Française that defines what is standard French. In Finland, nobody actually speaks the standard language that you would learn in a textbook. They all speak dialects, but they can obviously, they do it for the news broadcast, and they can obviously do it in a very formal setting. In Holland, in Netherlands, you have many different dialects, and they have to speak a standard. This is true for every country. Italy, I've spent time in Italy before, and nobody speaks. At least 20 years ago, when I lived there, nobody speaks Italian as the standard Italian, as their native language. They speak a language from the town that they come from. They're very proud, because if you don't speak the language from the town that you come from, how can you be a member of that community? So they're very proud of their own language, of where they're from. But then they also speak the national standard to speak. This is before the internet, so they speak to people. Now after the internet, I haven't spent time in Italy, but I'm sure that things are changing now that it's a generation later, and maybe more people are now speaking Italian as a standard when they grow up. But normally you do that at school, and you go home and you speak your local dialect.
Yeah. So would you say that it would sometimes be preferable to learn the dialect? For example, I could imagine a guy working in industry in Germany, and he wants to move over to I don't know, to North England. Would you then say if for him it would be better to speak a little like this, and is in order for the people to really acknowledge him and accept him?
Well, I think that if you're looking for social acceptance, go see your doctor first. But secondly, I think that there's nothing wrong with learning the standard language. But the reason why I focus so much on dialect is because I think it's important for us to understand dialect, because languages are rich and they're colorful and they have a lot of variety. And if your ears are closed off to everything, you're not like open-minded, then that is a problem. And it's important to be open-minded and to be able to understand that people have a variety of ways of expression. And so if you are going to spend a lot of time in Northern England, and you expect that your business, you're going to establish a business or a factory there, and you're going to be hiring local people, and I think it'll naturally, you're going to start speaking in the local way, without forcing it. It's just going to happen naturally. And then if you had learned English as a German speaker previously, and you spoke the standard, and then you start living in Northern England, you're going to start to adopt a lot of the natural, local way of speaking. So that's a very natural, it's a very visceral process. It's just very visceral, in meaning like you're just really alive in the moment, living in that community, and it just comes out. It's a human thing. It's very natural.
Mm-hmm. So Hilda, Miri, Marion, Gabi, Tobias, Sivan, Natalia, you can, of course, have one or two more questions, and then we will take it to a close. But maybe you can just use the chat and put one or two more questions in there. And now coming back to Glossika, like, for example, a provider of German language classes like the Goethe-Institut, how could they incorporate Glossika as a complementing tool for its teachers and language learners?
You know, I think that Glossika is a great tool for teachers and for students, but because the teacher's role really, you know, everybody has its own, you know, every tool that we use, like such as Glossika or other language companies' apps, and then the teacher's role and the student's role, everybody has a separate role. And so we're not looking for one to take away the role of another. The teacher's role is to explain where the student doesn't understand and has difficulty in trying to acquire the patterns, or the grammar, whatever it is, the word order. Oh, why is the werden here and why does it go there? You know, like things like this. And then the teacher is also in the role of a role play. So the conversational, like, what happens when I ask you this question? How do you respond? And so the student can go home and use Glossika every day to get that training and that training and that training and practice. Just like when I went to Poland, now I'm facing native speakers, and that's like taking me out of my bedroom and now putting me in a real life situation. And I'm now trying to role play and trying to perform like what I have actually practiced. And it's challenging. It can be nerve-wracking.
Yeah. So so you would say that human beings are still needed in teaching languages?
Well, if we could just insert a chip into our brain, wouldn't that be nice? But I think, you know, there's a fun journey of learning languages as well. We learn from our mistakes and whatever embarrassing things that happen. But, you know, those things actually help us build those long-term memories and those experiences. Experiences are very important. And go visit the country.
Not embarrassing, you said.
No, I mean, if it's embarrassing for you, I mean, it's you're likely to remember it for a very long time.
Yeah, and also language teachers. You think that we will definitely need them in order for correction, and or why would we need them if AI does the trick?
I think, you know, I'm really strongly against correction, because I believe that with enough exposure and practice, the student actually figures it out on their own. And then there are some really dull students who just never do. But I think that if they have poor pronunciation, they have poor grammar and everything else, you can just get them to say a complete sentence, any native speaker will understand them. But if they stop for just one word and one word and one word, nobody understands what you're saying. Nobody understands what you're trying to say. So if you can just spit out a whole sentence, I think it's much better. That is much better than just poor pronunciation and poor grammar and everything else. I've had this experience in Asia a lot. People they can only say English in just one word at a time, and I don't know if you're saying a verb. I don't know if you're saying a noun. You know, what are you asking me? What do you want? You know, can you just say like a sentence and then I'm fine? You know, you know. Okay, so the other part of the question was, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, the other part of the question was, do we still need language teachers?
No, so I said, you know, I'm against like always correcting the student, and so I think that the teacher's role really should be guidance. You know, I think that if you say it like this, few people will understand you. But if you try to move the word over here and then try saying it like this, follow me. You know, the teacher should be the guide and say, follow me, and not say, oh no, you're wrong. Oh no, that's incorrect, because then you're taking the students their emotions down. You know, you're pushing him back, and then he's going to have a reluctance to speak again, and maybe he's going to drop out of the class. So I think it's really important that we stand in the role of as a guide and say, hey, you know, I think what you're trying to do is good, but few people will understand how you're saying it, and I just recommend try to move this like this and say it like this, and then everybody will understand really, really well. And I think that that's a very positive communication.
And the correction part, that could be easily done by AI, but the guidance is probably something that is a little tougher for artificial intelligence, right?
I think if you are going to take the AI to do this guidance, the very tough aspect of that is actually detecting what the student has done, and then detecting how that is correct or incorrect. Because AI is getting so good where it can actually start to detect, especially with English, voice recognition, they have a lot of input from all over the world. So you can speak very poor English and it's going to understand what you're saying, but it's not going to correct you. It's just going to say, oh, I know what you're trying to say, because I have a lot of data that I've trained on. I've had a lot of incorrect English to train on. So you would have to have like two separate worlds of training data. Like, this is the correct way that this language is spoken, and this is the incorrect way. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to detect any inconsistencies and then show you the correct way. And that sounds like a very big project to me, a very expensive project.
Yeah. And maybe one last question to you with, I mean, I read somewhere that you are, you were only five, or you were one of 5 native speakers of the Tao language. And now they've passed away. You're probably the only person speaking it. Can AI also help in conserving old accents and languages?
Right. I mean, I think the preservation of these languages is also a very good application for AI. And we're still working out the. I mean, I should say that there are other. We say thou, like the English th, but there are actually a lot of other speakers of thou. They're just not native speakers now. In fact, the government is actually paying some salaries for people that just 100% of their time spent work on the language, learning the language and using the language and just using it around. Because I've met, I think maybe around 25 years old, a young woman who speaks it very well now. And I was impressed with her pronunciation, because not a lot of the Chinese, if you grow up speaking Chinese in that environment in Taiwan, it's very difficult for you to actually acquire the Aborigine pronunciation, because they have a lot of sounds that are just very kind of like Arabic. A lot of sounds like Arabic has, that if you're speaking a language like Chinese, it's just going to be very impossible to learn. So a lot of the speakers, they speak Thao, but they have a very bad pronunciation. And then she's like one of the individuals I met. I was just very impressed. Like, maybe she's learned Arabic or something. I don't know, but she has very, very good pronunciation. So I think that there's a lot of, it gives me hope. Like, I think that there are people out there, and she's a Thao, she's a young Thao. She's a member of the community, and she's indigenous. So I think there's hope that this will continue, and that there's interest, and there's this kind of push by younger people in the community to try to use the language. But yeah, the elders of the tribe have already passed away, who are native speakers. That's true.
Yeah, but also it would be important to start setting up AI and feeding data into a system where dialects can be preserved, as I understand you correctly. So you could actually use, if Bavarian would die out, you would at least have a program still speaking Bavarian.
Yeah.
And Hilda Malka, really the very last question now. Does the Chinese government preserve also languages of undesired minorities?
So I don't know very much about the communist government, but for the democratic government of Taiwan, where I live, I can speak on their behalf. There is an Indigenous Affairs Commission and a ministry within the government. And besides that, there's also a Hakka Affairs ministry for the Hakka people. They're a minority of Taiwan, and they have 6 dialects. Two major dialects. They're quite different, but and then there's no ministry. There's something they have been discussing in the news quite recently this year. They said, isn't it strange that the Hakka people have their own ministry and we Taiwanese do not have our own ministry, even though we speak Taiwanese language? And Taiwanese, we can call it Hokkien, which I referred to already. So Hokkien is kind of like the more international term, but in Taiwan, they don't call it Hokkien, they call it Taiwanese or Southern Min. There's an ISO code for the language called NAN. So the Southern Min language, it has varieties in China, in Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, and in Taiwan. And so in Taiwan, they just call it Taiwanese. But when I travel to Singapore, I can use Taiwanese and speak to the Singaporean taxi drivers completely no problem. I think they have like two common words for like market and other things that policeman and market, they have their own words, like very common things, they have their own words, but it's like very easy to pick up. So they understand and speak almost exactly the same way. So I've had no problem communicating. But some of the varieties in China are quite very different. So the government actually, some people are upset that they don't have their own Taiwanese commission, but there are so many people who speak the language. They feel like there doesn't need to be any sort of like preservation commission or anything, but they are working on the indigenous languages. Now all the indigenous languages have full dictionaries. They have training programs online. They have apps. They have YouTube channels. You know, a lot of things are now available for learning the indigenous languages. They have full curriculum as well. You know, many years of classroom study for anybody who wants to practice their own indigenous language. Even the Chinese ethnic majority can learn indigenous languages if they want to. So, but everybody's entitled to their own language. You know, you can learn Taiwanese in school, or you want to learn Hakka, but it's always served as a language class, not as language of instruction. In language of instruction is always in Mandarin.
Well, thank you very much,
Yes.
Michael Campbell. Kap on Kap. I hope you enjoy your time in Thailand, and I hope you can also speak Thai.
Kap kun kap. Yeah, to you as well.
No, it was a real pleasure, and it was really, really interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And, yeah, thank you everybody for watching. That was the last of our series. Vielen Dank, dass Sie alle dabei waren. Es war eine große Ehre, das auch für Sie moderieren zu dürfen. Und ich hoffe, dass wir Ihnen damit auch geben konnten, also einen Einblick geben konnten in die Welt der künstlichen Intelligenz und wie das Ganze funktioniert und zusammenwirkt mit Fremdsprachenlernen und dass die Fremdsprachenlehrer eben doch noch gebraucht werden. Ich glaube, das haben wir jetzt so ziemlich von allen gehört und das ist doch sehr beruhigend. Alleine heute haben wir es wieder gehört. Guidance.
Und ich danke Ihnen, danke Sie auch für diese Gelegenheit, hier zu reden über die Sprachen. Ja.
But you haven't answered the questions. How many languages do you actually speak?
So German does it count?
Well, that already counts, yeah.
Well, I don't know, more than a dozen languages, I suppose.
Excellent.
So some of them are works in progress, so we don't count them.
Excellent. So thank you very much once again. Thank you to everybody watching, and I hope to see you again one day with a new series. So thank you very much, and all the best.